They called her a traitor. She had chosen the word carefully when she accepted it. Traitor was a word that traveled. It was a word that stuck to a woman so completely that no one thought to look underneath it, at what she had actually done or why or for whom. For 7 years it had worked exactly as she intended. Anna Asbolt knelt in the snow before the execution platform and kept her chin level and thought, "He is alive. Whatever happens here today, he is alive." The chains were heavy. The crowd was loud. The Alpha King had not yet appeared. None of that mattered. The boy on the balcony was breathing. She had made sure of it herself. The snowflakes dissolved the moment they touched the torch flames. Anna noticed that, the way she always noticed small things even now. Even here, with her knees pressed into frozen ground and the kingdom's hatred pressing down on her like a second kind of weight. The royal banners cracked overhead in the frost-fang wind. The execution platform rose 30 feet ahead of her, black ironwood and elevated high enough that every wolf in the capital square could witness what came next. Thousands of them had gathered. All of them screaming. Except one. Declan stood at the royal balcony railing in his blue cloak, both hands gripping the stone, completely still in the storm of noise around him. He was 13 now, taller than she remembered, his jaw sharper, his eyes carrying something they hadn't held when he was 6. But the way he watched her hadn't changed at all. Not with cruelty. Not with the cold satisfaction the kingdom expected from a prince finally watching his kidnapper face justice. He watched her the way a child watches something they cannot stop from happening. Like he was the only person in all of Frostpeak who understood what this moment actually cost. Anna dropped her gaze to the snow beneath her knees before looking at him could finish breaking something she had spent 7 years carefully sealing shut. Here is what no one tells you about sacrificing everything for someone who will never be allowed to thank you. It does not feel noble. It does not feel like the stories. It feels like cold stone and silver burns and the low, endless hum of a wolf pressed so deep inside your chest she has almost forgotten how to howl. Anna's wolf had always been quiet. Too quiet, the pack healers said, when she was young and still hoping someone would explain it to her. Barely present. A flicker where there should have been a flame. It was why she had been ranked Omega, not for any failure of heart or courage, but simply because her wolf refused to surface the way other wolves did, refused to push and posture and assert. She had spent her whole life learning to work around that absence, to make herself useful in the ways available to someone the hierarchy had already decided did not matter. For 6 years before her imprisonment she had been a healer's assistant in the palace kitchens. Not the infirmary, never the infirmary, because the head physician would not permit an Omega servant that dignity. She ground yarrow root and dried frost moss in a lean-to shed behind the cooking fires and left the finished poultices at the infirmary door. She could identify 17 varieties of fever by scent. She could set a broken bone by touch alone. She had once rebuilt a stable boy's shattered forearm with splint wood and steady hands, and he had walked out without a limp, and no one had recorded her name in connection with it. That was fine. She had learned young that her name did not need to be recorded. What mattered was the work. What mattered was that someone had been helped. She carried that same philosophy into everything that followed. What Frostpeak remembered was not the yarrow poultices or the unnamed healings or the 7 years of silence. What Frostpeak remembered was that Anna Asbolt, forgotten Omega, palace servant, lowest-ranked wolf in the royal household, had stolen 6-year-old Prince Declan from his bed in the middle of the night and vanished into the Frostfang Mountains. She had returned him alive 3 months later. She had said nothing in her own defense. She had walked into her cell without fighting. The kingdom called it guilt. They called it proof. They sharpened their hatred on the story and passed it down through 7 years of retelling until it had worn into the shape of fact, smooth and permanent and completely wrong. An innocent woman, they reasoned, would have spoken. Would have wept and argued and demanded to be believed. Anna had done none of those things. She had done something far more dangerous. She had chosen silence, because silence was the only armor that kept the right people safe. Her wolf stirred beneath her ribs now. Not howling. Not fighting. Just present in the particular way it became present when danger was near, that low, vibrating awareness like a chord struck too deep to hear but felt all the way through the chest. 7 years, it seemed to say. We kept the secret 7 years. Hold a little longer. The Alpha King had not yet appeared on the platform. Braden Inwood, King of Frostpeak, sovereign of the Northern Territories, the wolf whose roar could silence a battlefield, was somewhere behind the great iron doors of the execution chamber. Anna was trying very hard not to think about what it would feel like when he finally walked through them. She was trying very hard not to think about what his face would look like when he saw her kneeling in the snow he ruled, in the chains his court had ordered, in the shame his kingdom had built around her name. She was also trying not to think about the thing she had found 3 nights ago. The black Fong symbol. Scratched fresh into the stone of her cell wall while she slept. Small. Precise. The kind of mark that was not left by accident. When she had pressed her palm flat against it, something had moved inside her sternum, something old and nameless and entirely unlike anything her quiet, flickering wolf had ever done, and the silver chains around her wrists had dimmed their burning for exactly 3 seconds. She had stared at her hands for a long time after that. She was still staring at them now when the explosion tore through the eastern gate of the capital. The crowd didn't scatter immediately. For one suspended breath, thousands of wolves simply froze, every instinct calculating the way predators calculate before they choose flight or fight. Then the second explosion struck, closer, and the rope barriers dissolved into chaos and fire and screaming that had nothing to do with executions. Anna raised her head. Through the smoke pouring between the buildings she could see them. Black-clad figures moving with the specific, practiced efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this. Not panicked. Not random. Coordinated. The prison guards were already shouting. Half moved toward the gate. The other half closed in tighter around Anna's chains, and that was the detail that confirmed what her wolf had already understood before her mind caught up. They were not here for the capital. They were not even here for the execution. They were here for her. And somewhere above the smoke and the chaos, she heard it, Declan's voice, young and high and suddenly terrified, and something in Anna Asbolt's chest that had been carefully, deliberately quiet for 7 years went very, very still. Not him, she thought. Not again. She had made her choice once. She had spent 7 years paying for it in silver and silence and a name that had become the kingdom's favorite curse. She would make the choice again without hesitation. She always had. That had been the whole point. 7 years ago, she became a prisoner so the Alpha King's son could live. She had never once regretted it. She was about to find out what it cost her to do it twice. The guard nearest Anna fell before she heard the arrow. One moment he was shouting orders into the smoke. The next he was on the ground, and the execution square had become something else entirely, not a place of ordered punishment but a killing ground, chaotic and fast, the kind of violence that moved like weather. She didn't run. She had nowhere to run to. The chains connecting her wrists were bolted to an iron stake driven deep into the platform base. She pulled once, testing. The silver bit back immediately, and she swallowed the sound that tried to rise from her throat and made herself think instead. Count them. Count what you can see. 6 black-clad figures through the smoke. Moving in formation. Not toward the palace gates, not toward the royal balcony where the court was now erupting into screaming disorder. Toward her. Straight toward her, with the purposeful economy of wolves who had been given one specific task and intended to complete it. A second guard went down. Then a third. From somewhere above the chaos she heard Braden's voice, commanding, furious, the Alpha King's authority cutting through the noise like a blade, and she heard him stop mid-order. She knew the moment he saw it. She felt the pause in him the way you feel a change in wind direction. Why, that pause said, "Are they moving toward the prisoner?" She had wondered how long it would take him to ask that question. She had hoped it would take longer than this. 7 years earlier it had been a different kind of fire. Not smoke and arrows. Candlelight. The low, amber warmth of the east corridor in the palace's 3rd floor, where Anna had been carrying a basket of fever compresses to the night watch and had made the mistake of walking quietly. She had always walked quietly. Omegas learned young that silence was safer. That night, silence saved a life. The voices came from behind the council antechamber door, left open a careful inch by someone who had not thought to check the corridor. 2 men, nobles from the weight of their diction, speaking in the clipped, deliberate tones of people who had already decided something and were now arranging the details. The boy must not reach his 7th year. The syndicate has their people placed. 3 inside the household. It will look like fever. And the king? Griefstricken. Manageable. A king without an heir is a king whose attention is elsewhere. Anna had stood in the corridor for 3 seconds without breathing. Then she had walked past the door at exactly the same pace, basket in arms, face empty, heart hammering so hard she was surprised neither man heard it through the wall. She had gone straight to the head physician. He had looked at her, really looked at her, the way people looked at Omegas when Omegas said inconvenient things, and told her to go back to the kitchen. She had tried the night captain next, then the queen's lady-in-waiting, then the royal record-keeper who had laughed. An Omega servant. Overheard a whisper. Frightened herself in a corridor. Nobody would believe her. Nobody was going to believe her. And somewhere in the palace, 3 people were already inside the household. She had stood in the lean-to shed that night with her hands flat on the work table, looking at the yarrow and the frost moss and the small, careful life she had built in the only space the world had allowed her. She had thought about what happened to little boys when the people who were supposed to protect them decided he was inconvenient. She had thought about what happened to Omega servants who disappeared with royal children. Then she had gone to find Declan. The chain snapped. Not from her pulling, from the stake itself, half buried and poorly set in ground frozen too hard and too fast in the chaos of installation. Anna stumbled forward onto her hands in the snow as one of the black-clad figures closed the last 20 feet between them. She rolled. Got her knees under her. Came up with the broken chain swinging from her left wrist like a weapon she hadn't planned on having. The figure stopped. From the far edge of the square, close enough now that she could hear him clearly over everything, a voice she didn't recognize screamed an order across the smoke and the falling bodies and the ruin of what had been her execution. Find the girl. Kill the Guardian. The square went briefly, strangely quiet around that word. Guardian. Anna watched Braden Inwood's head turn, slowly, with the deliberate control of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood, in her direction. His eyes found hers through the smoke. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then she ran toward the palace. Toward Declan. As she always had. She knew the palace the way she knew her own hands. 7 years of imprisonment had not taken that from her. The servant corridors, the back staircases, the places where the stonework ran thin and sound carried, she had memorized all of it in 6 years of quiet, invisible work, and the knowledge sat in her body like instinct now, directing her feet before her mind had finished deciding. The smoke was thicker inside. Torches had been knocked from their brackets in the chaos, and somewhere in the east wing something was burning in earnest, filling the upper corridors with a low, rolling heat that pressed down from the ceiling. Guards ran past her in both directions. None of them stopped an unchained woman moving with purpose. In a crisis, purpose looked like authority. She took the servants' staircase to the 3rd floor. The royal chambers were ahead, behind the heavy ironwood doors that were standing open, forced by the look of the splintered frame, and Anna was through them before she'd fully processed what that meant. The antechamber was empty. Overturned furniture. A guard's sword abandoned on the floor. Then a sound. Small. Deliberate. Someone trying very hard not to make noise. She crossed to the wardrobe in 4 steps and pulled the door open, and Declan looked up at her from the floor with his knees drawn to his chest and his jaw clenched in an expression she recognized completely, because she had taught it to him. Be quiet. Be still. Wait for me. He stared at her for 1 suspended second. Then he was on his feet and his arms were around her before she'd thought to open hers, and Anna stood very still in the middle of the burning palace with the Alpha King's son's face pressed against her shoulder and her silver-scarred wrists hovering just above his back, afraid to hold on, and then holding on anyway. I knew you'd come, he said into her shoulder. I knew it. She couldn't answer that. She pressed her hand once against the back of his head, quick, careful, and then stepped back and looked at him properly. 13. Tajir. His father's jaw beginning to show in the lines of his face. But his eyes were the same eyes that had watched her from across a firelit cave while she sat outside in the cold and told him through the opening that the hunters had gone, that it was safe, that she would stay awake so he could sleep. He had believed her every time. He believed her now. She could feel it in the way he straightened, the way his breathing steadied the moment she was present, like her proximity was a thing his body had remembered without his permission. Behind her, boots on stone. She turned. Braden Inwood filled the doorway, black armor, sword drawn, every line of him radiating the particular fury of a man who had been afraid and had converted it immediately into something colder. His eyes moved from Anna to Declan and back to Anna, and she watched him absorb it. His son's posture, his son's face, the absence of any fear in Declan's body that was not the fear of the smoke and the attack but never, not for a single moment, fear of her. The sword lowered. Slightly. Not fully. Step away from him, Braden said. Declan stepped forward instead. He moved until he was standing beside Anna, not behind her, not at a distance, but beside her, shoulder aligned with her arm, and looked at his father with the particular calm of someone who had decided what they believed and was not interested in revising it. She didn't kidnap me, he said. His voice was steady. Certain. The voice of someone who had carried a truth for 7 years and was finally, at last, allowed to put it down. She saved me. The sword lowered the rest of the way. Braden said nothing. But something in his face, the absolute granite certainty of a king who had condemned a woman and never once questioned it, shifted. Fractured. Opened into something that looked, just briefly, like a man who understood he had been catastrophically wrong. Anna did not let herself feel that yet. There was still smoke in the corridors and Declan was still in danger and there would be time later, or there wouldn't be, but right now there was only the next door and the next staircase and the work directly in front of her. That had always been enough. She reached out and took Declan's hand. "We need to move," she said. And without hesitation he moved. They put Declan in the war room with 6 guards and a locked door, and then Braden walked Anna into the small council anteroom off the main corridor and closed that door too, and for the first time in 7 years they were alone in a room together. She had not been this close to him since the trial. He was bigger than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply spent 7 years compressing the memory of him into something manageable and the reality of him refused to stay compressed. He moved the way dominant wolves moved, like the space around him had already agreed to accommodate whatever he needed from it. He set his sword against the wall, crossed his arms, looked at her the way she imagined he looked at things he intended to understand completely. "The prison records don't match," he said. "No preamble. 3 witnesses who testified at your trial. Gone. Relocated before the first year was out, according to the court clerk. The original arrest documentation, the guard reports, the night watch logs, there are gaps. Specific gaps. The kind that don't happen by accident." Anna said nothing. "Someone manipulated your case," Braden continued. "Someone with enough access to the court records to alter them cleanly and enough influence to move witnesses without question." He paused. "I want to know who. And I want to know what you know about it." The fire in the small grate between them crackled. Anna looked at it instead of him. "I don't know who," she said. Which was true. "But you knew the records were wrong." A longer pause. "Yes." She heard him exhale, not with anger but with the particular controlled restraint of someone absorbing a thing that had cost them enormously. "You stayed," he said. 7 years. You never attempted an escape. You refused 3 separate legal review petitions. I reviewed your file this afternoon. You declined every one." His voice was very even. "Why?" Anna lifted her gaze from the fire and looked at him directly for the first time. "Because the Black Fang was still watching," she said. "As long as I was the condemned prisoner, as long as the kingdom believed the story, Declan was ordinary. He was the prince whose kidnapper was rotting in a cell. He wasn't worth hunting anymore." She kept her voice flat. "Factual. The moment I was exonerated, the moment anyone started asking the right questions about why I'd really taken him, they would have known the conspiracy was still exposed. And they would have come back to finish it." She watched him understand it. Watched the calculation move behind his eyes. "You kept yourself imprisoned," he said slowly, "to keep him safe." "It worked," she said. "For 7 years it worked." He moved before she registered that he'd decided to, 2 steps closing the distance between them, close enough now that she could see the specific silver threading through the dark of his eyes, and something happened that Anna had no framework for and no warning of whatsoever. Her wolf, that quiet, half-present, perpetually muted thing that had never once fully surfaced in 24 years of living, surged. Not a flicker. Not the low vibrating awareness she'd felt during the attack. A surge, vast and sudden, like a door blown open by a pressure that had been building on the other side of it for an unknowable amount of time. She stepped back hard into the wall. Braden had gone completely still. His expression was not the expression of a king conducting an interrogation. It was the expression of a man who had just been struck by something he hadn't known to brace for and was trying, with visible effort, to remain standing. "No," Anna said. The word came out before she'd decided on it. "Anna?" "No." She pressed her scarred wrists flat against the stone wall behind her, grounding herself in the familiar cold, the familiar burn. "I am a prisoner. I am the woman your kingdom has spent 7 years calling a traitor. I am broken in ways you haven't seen yet and don't have time to understand." She met his eyes and held them. "You are the Alpha King. Whatever your wolf thinks it recognizes, it's wrong. Or it doesn't matter. Either way, it doesn't change anything." Braden looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at her wrists, at the silver pale ridges pressed into her skin, 7 years of damage written in scar tissue, and something moved across his face that he didn't manage to contain in time. Not pity. Something older and rawer than pity. Something that looked, unmistakably, like a man realizing the full weight of what had been done to someone in his name, by his court, under his authority, while he had simply let it happen. She watched him carry that. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. Declan refused to sleep in the war room. He made this known quietly, without argument, in the way he had apparently learned to make most things known. A simple, immovable stillness that communicated his intention more effectively than any amount of protest. He wanted to be where Anna was. He communicated this to his father's senior guard with the particular patience of someone who understood he was going to win and was simply waiting for everyone else to arrive at the same conclusion. They gave him a chair outside the anteroom door. When Anna emerged an hour after Braden, Declan was sitting in it with his cloak pulled around his shoulders and his eyes open, watching the corridor. He stood up the moment he saw her. "You should be sleeping," she said. "You should have been released 6 years ago," he replied. "We're both living with disappointment." She looked at him, really looked at him, the sharpness of him, the dry precision that had not been in his voice when he was 6, and felt something in her chest shift in a way she hadn't prepared for. "Come on," she said. "There's a fire in the east sitting room." He followed her without being asked twice. He talked, once the fire was going and the corridor outside had quieted. She had not expected that. She had expected the careful reserve of a prince, the formal distance of a boy raised in a court that measured every word. Instead she got Declan, the real one apparently, the one that existed under the titles, pulling his knees up on the chair across from her and telling her in a low, steady voice that he had never forgotten a single day of those 3 months. "You read to me," he said. "Every night. You didn't have a book so you made the stories up. There was one about a wolf who could walk through snow without leaving prints." Anna remembered. She hadn't known he was listening. She had thought he was already asleep. "You carried me through the Frostfang Pass when the cold got bad. I remember the sound your breathing made. Like you were counting steps." He paused. "Were you?" "Yes," she said. "I thought so." He was quiet for a moment. "There was a night I was half asleep. 3 hunters came close to the cave. You put me behind you. I heard you make a sound I'd never heard before. They left." Anna said nothing. She remembered that night differently, remembered the specific animal terror of it, the way her body had moved in front of him before her mind had finished deciding, the sound that had come out of her that she still couldn't explain and had never been able to replicate. "You almost didn't make it back after that," Declan said. Not an accusation. Just a fact he had been carrying. "You were sick for 4 days. You kept telling me you were fine." "I was fine," Anna said. He looked at her with an expression that was entirely his father's. "You were not fine." She noticed the burns an hour later, when she pushed her sleeve back absently near the fire. The silver marks on her left wrist, the ones that had been raw and weeping since the execution platform, had faded. Not healed the way wounds healed over days. Faded. As though the damage was being quietly reabsorbed by something working underneath the skin. She pressed her thumb against the site. No pain. She pulled her sleeve back down before Declan saw. But the royal healer, summoned by Braden's orders to assess the household after the attack, had apparently already seen something. He appeared in the doorway of the sitting room an hour before dawn, his expression stripped of its professional composure in a way that suggested he had encountered something his training had not prepared him for. He looked at Anna. "Your wolf signature," he said carefully, "is not what it was this morning." He held his notes like they had personally unsettled him. "It's changing." Across the fire, Declan looked at Anna. Anna looked at her hands. In the space between her fingers, just for a moment, there and gone before she could be certain she'd seen it at all, something blue-white flickered. Like a candle. Like a star. Like something very old waking up. Braden did not sleep. He sent the healer away with instructions to document everything and say nothing, and then he went to the royal archive himself, alone, at the hour when the palace was at its quietest and the only sounds were the wind off the Frostfang peaks and the distant settling of fire-damaged stonework in the east wing. The archive was 3 levels below the main court. Cold even by Frost Peak standards. The kind of cold that felt deliberate, the cold of things that had been kept from the light for a very long time. He started with the oldest records. The ones nobody had reason to consult in generations. The first reference appeared in a territorial ledger from 200 years prior. A marginal notation, half in a script that predated the current court language, beside an entry about the consolidation of the northern kingdoms. He had to read it 3 times before he trusted his translation. Moon Guardian bloodline confirmed in attendance. Heir secured. Record sealed by royal order. He kept going. The references were sparse and deliberate, the kind of sparse that came not from absence but from careful removal. Someone had gone through these records methodically, and whatever they had taken they had not been thorough enough. What remained told a story in fragments. The Moon Guardians had not been soldiers. They had not been warriors in any conventional sense. They were protectors, specifically, inexplicably, instinctively bonded to royal bloodlines in ways the old scholars described with a reverence that sat uncomfortably beside the dry language of court documentation. Healing that defied conventional wolf physiology. Shields that manifested as physical force. Soul bonds that allowed a guardian to locate and protect a charge across impossible distances. One entry, older than the rest, used a phrase Braden read twice: "The guardian does not choose the heir. The bond chooses. It cannot be trained or assigned. It simply is." He set the ledger down. Picked up the next one. Anna's mother appeared in the records 31 years ago. Not under her own name, under a service designation, a palace staff number, the notation used for household members the court wished to document without drawing attention to. But the Queen's private correspondence, bundled and sealed and apparently never reviewed after her death, contained a letter in handwriting Braden recognized from childhood. "She came to me frightened. She knew what she carried and she knew what they would do when they found her. I have hidden the child's signature. The bloodline will sleep until it is needed. God willing, it will never be needed. God willing, the girl will simply live." Braden sat with that letter for a long time. His queen. His dead wife. Who had known. Who had looked at a frightened woman carrying a child with an ancient bloodline that powerful people wanted erased, and had hidden them both with a quiet, deliberate compassion that had made him love her. Who had never told him. Because she had known, perhaps, what he would have done with the information. He thought about that for longer than was comfortable. He found the Black Fong operational records last. Seized documents from a raid 6 years ago that had been filed and forgotten in the chaos of the aftermath. He read them with the cold focus of a man who had already begun to understand what he was going to find. The primary target designation appeared on the 3rd page. Not Declan. Not the crown. A name. A bloodline. A threat assessment dated 7 years ago, 3 months before Anna had taken his son into the mountains, that described the Moon Guardian lineage as an existential risk to the Syndicate's long-term operational capacity and recommended immediate termination upon confirmation of awakening. Declan had never been the target. He had been the lure. They had known Anna's bond instinct would activate the moment the boy was in danger. They had manufactured the danger specifically to draw her out, to confirm the bloodline, to get her into the open where she could be eliminated quietly. She had taken Declan and run, and in doing so had accidentally saved both of them by disappearing before the Syndicate could close the trap. She had not known any of this. She had simply followed the instinct that was written into her blood, and it had looked, from every external angle, exactly like a kidnapping. Braden closed the file. He sat in the cold of the archive for a moment that stretched longer than he intended, and then he stood and climbed back toward the light. Anna was in the east sitting room where he had left her. Declan had finally fallen asleep in the chair across from her, cloak tucked to his chin. She was watching the fire with her hands open in her lap, and she looked up when Braden entered. He crossed the room and crouched in front of her so their eyes were level, and he held out the Black Fong operational file without speaking. She looked at it, then at him. She took it. He watched her read. Watched the moment she reached the 3rd page, the primary target designation, her own bloodline named in the flat, procedural language of people who had decided she needed to die before she understood what she was. Her hands went very still. "They never wanted Declan," she said. "No. He was." "Yes." She closed the file. Set it carefully on the arm of the chair. And then she looked at her hands again, the way she had been looking at them since the healer's visit, with the particular attention of someone trying to understand something that was happening inside them that they had no language for yet. The fire cracked. And in the dark of the sitting room, with Declan breathing quietly across from them and the Frostfang wind pressing against the shuttered windows, Anna's eyes opened, fully opened, the way a wolf's eyes open when it finally, after a lifetime, surfaces completely. Blue-white, luminous, ancient. Her wolf did not howl. It simply arrived, vast and quiet and terribly patient, like something that had always been there, waiting without urgency for the moment its name was finally spoken aloud. Anna stared at nothing. At everything. "Oh," she said softly. Like she recognized it. Like she had always known. The names came out before dawn. 3 senior nobles. 2 court administrators. 1 man who had served on the Royal Security Council for 11 years and had attended every strategy meeting held in the aftermath of the Capitol attack, including the ones where Braden had discussed what he'd found in the archive. They were taken quietly, before the palace woke, by guards Braden had selected personally from outside the usual chain of command. 2 confessed within the hour. Not because they broke easily, but because they had already calculated that the Syndicate was finished and were trying to negotiate something from the wreckage. What they offered instead was a warning. The Capitol assault had not been the operation. It had been the signal. The real operation was already in motion. The first Black Fang battalion appeared on the northern ridge at mid-morning. By noon there were thousands. They came out of the Frostfang passes in organized columns, not the chaotic surge of raiders but the measured advance of a force that had been staging for weeks in the mountain approaches, waiting for the signal that the internal network had confirmed the target's location. They moved through the snow with the unhurried confidence of wolves who believed they had already won, and they spread across the valley below Frost Peak Citadel like a tide finding the shape of a shore. Braden watched them from the battlements for exactly as long as it took to count their formations. Then he turned and began giving orders. The citadel transformed in under an hour. Braden had trained for this, had trained his entire adult life for the specific problem of defending Frost Peak against a coordinated northern assault, and the machinery of it activated cleanly, each piece moving into position with the efficiency of a thing long rehearsed. Pack soldiers took the walls. Mounted warriors formed in the outer courtyard, black armor catching the flat winter light, royal banners cracking in the Frostfang wind above them. He took the courtyard himself. Anna found him there, in the organized chaos of final preparations, and he looked at her once with the particular expression of a man who had too many things to say and no time in which to say them. "Declan stays in the inner keep," he said. "Second level. 6 guards minimum. The stairwells are defensible." "I know," she said. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he turned back to his captains. She went to find Declan. The boy was not in the inner keep. He had been, she could track the path of his obedience, the 6 guards still stationed exactly where they'd been placed. But somewhere in the hour since Braden had issued the order, Declan had apparently decided that obedience had limits. She found him on the inner battlements, watching the northern ridge. "You were supposed to stay below," she said. "I wanted to see," he replied. He said it without apology, which was so completely his father's quality that it almost stopped her breath. He was watching the black columns moving through the snow below with his jaw set and his shoulders straight, and he looked both entirely too young for what he was witnessing and entirely too composed for his age. Anna came to stand beside him. For a moment they simply watched together, the vast, slow movement of the enemy force, the mounted warriors in the courtyard below beginning to advance through the outer gates, the royal banners above them bright against the pewter sky. "They came for you," Declan said quietly. "Not a question." "Yes." "Because of what you are." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm glad you didn't know. When you took me." He kept his eyes on the ridge. "If you'd known what they really wanted, you might have decided you were the one who needed to disappear." "Not me." Anna had no answer for that. Because he was not wrong. The ground shook. Not the percussion of distant artillery, something structural, something immediate, the specific vibration of stonework that had been compromised at its foundation. Anna grabbed Declan's arm as the inner battlement lurched beneath them, a sound like tearing rising from somewhere deep in the eastern wall. The Black Fang had come through the foundation tunnels. Of course they had. Of course the 11-year member of the Royal Security Council had known the tunnels existed. The eastern wall buckled. The section of battlement directly ahead of them dropped away in a cascade of ancient stone and frozen mortar, taking the stairwell with it. Both stairwells, she realized, scanning fast, both access points to the inner keep gone in the same collapse. Declan looked at the gap where the stairs had been. Then he looked at Anna. They were cut off. Below, through the smoke and the falling stone and the sound of battle breaking open across the citadel, she heard Braden's voice, commanding, furious, and for the first time in all the years she had known what it meant to hear an alpha king afraid, cracked at the edges with something that was not fury at all. She felt something answer it in her chest. Not the wolf exactly. Something older. Something that had been waiting for precisely this. The enemy commander came through the collapsed eastern wall himself. That told Anna everything she needed to know about how this had been designed. Not a general directing from a distance. A man who had waited specifically for this moment, who had wanted to be present for it. He was large, unhurried, moving through the rubble of the battlement with the ease of someone who had already decided how the next 10 minutes would go. He had 4 soldiers with him. He looked at Anna. He looked at Declan. He smiled, which was the worst thing he could have done because it confirmed what she had already understood, that Declan was not the objective. Declan was the instrument. He was the lever and she was the door, and everything that followed was simply a matter of applying the right pressure. "We don't want the boy hurt," the commander said. His voice was reasonable. Almost gentle. "We never did. He was always just a means of finding you." He tilted his head. "Come quietly and he walks away. That's the whole offer. That's all this ever needed to be." Declan said very quietly, "Don't." Anna looked at him. His jaw was clenched. His hands were at his sides. He was 13 years old and he was trying, with every line of his body, to tell her not to do what she was already deciding to do. She looked back at the commander. "All right," she said. And then she stepped forward, not toward the commander but toward the center of the broken battlement, into the open space where the collapsed wall had left a gap in the fortress like a wound, where the full scope of the battlefield below was visible for the first time, and she stopped and she opened her hands and she stopped fighting it. She had been fighting it since the sitting room. Since the blue-white light. Since the moment in the archive anteroom when her wolf had surged and she had pressed herself back against the wall and said no. To Braden, to the bond, to everything her blood was trying to tell her she was. She stopped saying no. It did not feel the way she had imagined power would feel. It felt like remembering. Like a word she had known as a child and lost and found again in the back of a drawer she hadn't opened in years. It moved through her without violence, without the tearing urgency of a shift she had never been able to complete. It simply arrived, the way the wolf in the sitting room had arrived, patient and vast and entirely certain of itself. The light came first. Blue-white, luminous, the specific quality of moonlight concentrated into something that had weight and warmth and direction. It rose from her hands and moved outward, and she felt it find the edges of things, the wounded soldiers below on the citadel walls, the guards with silver burns on their arms, the places where her pack was breaking under pressure, and she felt it reach. She had always been a healer. She had simply never understood the scale of it. Below, the battle shifted. Wolves who had been driven back found their footing. Silver burns closed on the arms of the wall guards. A mounted warrior who had taken a crossbow bolt to the shoulder reached up mid-charge and found the wound sealed. None of them understood what was happening. All of them felt it, warmth, sudden and sourceless, moving through them like the memory of something they had never personally experienced but recognized in their blood. The Black Fang soldiers stopped advancing. Not from a tactical decision. From something more instinctive than tactics. They looked up. Above them, on the broken eastern battlement, the wolf manifested. Not Anna's body. Anna remained standing, hands open, eyes luminous and fixed on the middle distance. But behind her and above her, rising from the light she was generating like a form emerging from fog, a wolf took shape. White. Enormous. Constructed entirely of the blue-white luminescence, its edges moving like flame, its eyes the specific bright blue of something ancient and undefeated. It did not howl. It simply stood. The commander took one step backward. Anna walked toward Declan. The four soldiers between them moved out of her way. She wasn't certain they decided to. She thought perhaps their wolves decided for them, the way wolves sometimes made decisions that the person carrying them couldn't override. Deep, biological, the recognition of something in the hierarchy of things that simply outranked them. She put her hand on Declan's shoulder. The shield extended around him like a closing hand. She felt it, felt the specific quality of it, the way the bond that had been written into her blood 30 years before she understood it recognized him and locked. This one. Always this one. From the beginning, always this one. She turned back to the commander. He was still standing. She gave him credit for that. "Leave," she said. He left. The battle ended the way battles ended when something had gone out of the force driving them, not in a single dramatic moment but in increments, one unit falling back, then another, the coordinated advance becoming a retreat, becoming a rout as the Black Fang soldiers below understood that whatever they had been promised, whatever intelligence had told them this operation was containable, had been wrong. Braden came through the inner gate with his guard when it was nearly done. He stopped when he saw the wolf of light above the battlement. He stood in the snow of the citadel courtyard with his sword still drawn and his armor dark with the work of the last hour, and he looked up at what Anna had become, and Anna, from the height of the broken wall, looked down at him. The wolf behind her was already fading. Its work was finished. She was breathing hard. Her legs were uncertain beneath her. Declan had both hands on her arm, holding on with the particular grip of someone who intended to be the thing that kept her upright, and she let him because she needed it. The citadel was quiet. The banners above them snapped in the Frostfang wind. Below, Braden Inwood, king of Frost Peak, sovereign of the Northern Territories, the man who had condemned her and doubted her and was standing in the snow of his own courtyard looking at her like he was only now, at this precise moment, understanding the full shape of what she was, sheathed his sword. He did not look away. Neither did she. It was over. It was, in every way that mattered, just beginning. The mastermind was not who anyone expected. He was not a soldier or a syndicate enforcer. He was 71 years old, slight, soft-spoken, and had served as the royal archive keeper for 4 decades. The man who had catalogued the kingdom's records, who had known exactly which documents to remove and which gaps to leave, who had spent 40 years in the one room in Frost Peak that contained the truth about Anna's bloodline, ensuring that no one who came looking would ever find it intact. They brought him to Braden in the Great Hall at nightfall. He did not ask for mercy. He seemed, if anything, relieved. "Her mother came to the palace the year before you took the throne," he said. His voice was steady. The voice of a man reciting something he had rehearsed in the architecture of his own guilt for 30 years. She knew what she carried. She knew the syndicate had begun hunting the bloodline. They had already taken her sister, her mother before that. The Moon Guardians had been hunted to extinction deliberately over generations, because the Black Fang understood what a living guardian meant for any royal line she bonded to. He paused. An unbreakable protector. An undefeatable shield. Everything the syndicate's operational model depended on destroying. "The Queen hid her," Braden said. "Yes. And hid the child after her. Suppressed the wolf signature, erased the bloodline records, buried the service documentation." He looked at his hands. "I helped. I believed it was protection. And it was for a time." "And the mother?" A silence. "The syndicate found her when Anna was 4. The Queen ensured the child was never connected to what happened." He raised his eyes to Braden's. "Anna never knew. She grew up believing she was simply an orphan. An Omega nobody. Which was exactly what we needed the world to believe." The hall was very quiet. "The Queen died," Braden said, "protecting a secret that would have saved my kingdom years of damage. She died believing the secret would never need to surface. That the bloodline would sleep and the girl would simply live." He closed his eyes briefly. She was almost right. Braden addressed the kingdom the following morning. He did it in the Capitol Square, the same platform, the same iron torches still blackened from the execution fires that had been lit 2 days ago for a different purpose entirely. The crowd that gathered was larger than the one that had come to watch Anna kneel. Word had moved through the city overnight the way urgent things moved, person to person, faster than any official announcement. He told them everything. He did not soften it. Did not manage it into a version that reflected better on the court that had failed her, or the king who had condemned her, or the kingdom that had spent 7 years sharpening its hatred on the name of a woman who had walked into a cell voluntarily to keep their prince alive. He told them the archive records. The Queen's letters. The Black Fang operational file with its primary target designation. The 3 months in the Frostfang Mountains, the blizzards, the hunters, the cave where a 24-year-old Omega servant had placed herself between an assassin's trap and a 6-year-old boy and chosen, without hesitation, to burn for it. He told them what she was. What she had always been. The square was silent in a way it had not been silent the morning before, not the silence of a crowd withholding breath before violence, but the silence of thousands of wolves absorbing something that was rearranging the architecture of what they thought they understood. Anna was standing to the left of the platform when Braden descended the steps. She had not been placed there by protocol. There was no protocol for this. She had simply stood where she could see his face while he spoke, and when he finished and came down the steps toward her, the crowd parting without being asked, she found that she had no prepared response for the way he looked at her. He stopped in front of her. He did not reach for her hand the way the stories would have written it, the grand gesture, the sweeping declaration. He simply looked at her, with the specific quality of attention she had come to understand meant he was not performing anything, and said, quietly enough that it was nearly private. "I claimed you condemned. I should have protected you." Pause. "I am asking, in front of every wolf in this kingdom, if you will allow me to spend whatever time you give me correcting that." Behind him the crowd was very still. Anna looked at him for a long moment. At the square around them, the platform, the torches, the banners. At the specific geography of the place that had been built to end her and had instead become the place where everything was being painstakingly rebuilt. "Don't ask me," she said. "Ask your wolf." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile but the thing that existed just before one. "My wolf," he said, "has been asking since the anteroom. I'm attempting to give you the courtesy of a choice." She held his gaze. "Then yes," she said. Declan came off the platform steps at a pace that was technically restrained and practically a run, and he hit Anna with the specific force of a 13-year-old boy who had been maintaining composure for approximately 36 hours and had reached his absolute limit. She caught him, both arms properly this time, no hesitation, and he pressed his face against her shoulder and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "You're not leaving." "No," she said. "You're staying." "Yes." He pulled back enough to look at her with red-rimmed eyes and his father's relentless composure cracking at every seam. "I already decided your family. I decided 7 years ago. I just couldn't say it. Anna pressed her hand once against the back of his head. She had no words for that either. So she simply held on. She stood beside Braden and Declan as the morning light moved across the Capitol Square, and the crowd below them was not screaming her name like a curse but carrying it differently, quietly, carefully, the way people carry something they have just learned the true weight of. No chains. No platform. No snow pressing cold and final against her knees. Only the frostfang wind and the banners above, and Declan's shoulder warm against her arm, and Braden's hand finding hers in the space between them with the quiet certainty of a man who had made his decision and intended to keep it. She thought about her mother, who had run from this kingdom frightened and alone and had never seen what the bloodline she carried would eventually become. She thought about the queen who had hidden them both and died hoping the secret would never need to surface. She thought about the lean-to shed and the yarrow root and the 6 years of invisible work and the night she had stood at the work table with her hands flat on the wood and made the only choice that had ever truly mattered. She thought about a 6-year-old boy sleeping safely in a cave while snow fell outside. 7 years ago she became a prisoner so the Alpha King's son could live. Tonight the kingdom finally learned the truth. The woman they had condemned was the reason they still had a prince, a king and a future at all. If you made it to the end of Anna's story you already know. She was never just a prisoner. She was the reason the kingdom survived. And if this story kept you up, made you feel something or made you root for a woman in chains who refused to break, then let me know. Hit subscribe. Anna's world has more stories to tell and I don't want you to miss a single one. Leave a like if you believed in her before Braden did. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Whether it's 2 a.m. in Houston, Texas or your lunch break in London, drop your location. This community is building something and I want to know who's in it. Thank you for being here.